and we're both with the USGS Alaska Science Center. I'm office chief for the terrestrial ecosystems research group here, and Jerry Hupp is a research wildlife biologist in our group. And I'm going to give you an overview of our USGS Changing Arctic Ecosystems initiative, and then Jerry's going to give a real specific example of some of the research we're doing up on the North Slope. So the initiative Changing Arctic Ecosystems, or CAE as we sometimes call it, began really in 2007 when the Secretary of the Interior asked USGS to conduct a whole suite of analyses on uncertainty related to polar bear projections in terms of population status and trends into the future, so that they can make a decision about listing or not listing polar bears. So USGS provided those results, and the Department of Interior and Fish and Wildlife Service used those in their decision, and polar bears were listed in 2008 as threatened. And then beginning in 2010, the department asked USGS to continue doing polar bear research, but also to broaden it to include other species, using a similar sort of framework and analysis framework that was used for the polar bear, to understand the response of wildlife in both terrestrial and marine ice-dominated ecosystems in the Arctic. And so that is when our initiative began, was in 2010, focusing not just on polar bears, but a variety of wildlife species that we've identified to understand the response to changes in the Arctic. And so just to kind of give you an idea of that framework that was used for the polar bear, this is actually the similar framework that was used for Pacific walrus by Chad Jay in our office. And it's a Bayesian network model and a software program called Medica. Basically, it allows researchers and managers to nodes into the model of everything that could possibly be related to the future outcome that's identified to be, as well as all the bottom-up sort of drivers of that future outcome. And
all right, John, I'm going to ask you to pause for just a second. Could we have everyone mute, please? I can see it popping up. Call-in users are popping up, which means you guys aren't muted, and there's a lot of background noise. Thanks.
So the useful thing about this model is it allows us to put in things that we have knowledge about, but maybe no hard data, as well as things that we do indeed have empirical data for. And then you can model sort of your level of uncertainty and also sort of understand the impacts of all these different nodes and how they influence the future outcomes. So this is helpful from not only a sort of a research framework of what we'd like to study into the future, but also for allowing research managers to sort of toggle these different boxes on and off to see what sort of impacts these different nodes have on the future outcome. So this is kind of a busy slide, sort of a more reduced slide. Conceptual model of the walrus model is this version, and that just sort of shows you sort of the bottom up, or in this case it looks like they're coming from the top, to the ultimate outcome, which is the population response to these different nodes that are all interrelated. And so this is really sort of the kind of models that we're trying to use in all the studies that we're doing as part of Changing Arctic Ecosystems, and I'll get to that in a minute. And so this modeling framework we put into a publication that was published last year in Bioscience, written by a number of USGS authors here at the Alaska Science Center. So if folks are interested in sort of what we're observing thus far and our modeling sort of ideas about how to put this all together and integrate it into single models for species, this would be a good place to go and look at is this publication that recently came out. And in that, we published this conceptual model that could be used for sort of really any wildlife response study that we're doing in Changing Arctic Ecosystems, and that could also be used by resource managers that want to understand what part of this process is influencing the response of focal species up at the top of that diagram. Whereas at the bottom, is a place where we can start thinking about what physical drivers might be involved, and then on the right-hand side of that panel, sort of links in some possible human activities and then some community-level interactions among different species that are now taking place in the Arctic that could also be plugged into the model at different places. So this is a conceptual model, and in the paper we actually developed this more fully for walrus to show how this could be done for walrus, and as a way to show how it could be done for other species as well. So we're trying to apply this model to all the different species and all the different sort of studies that we're doing in Changing Arctic Ecosystems. Just to sort of talk about how CAE fits into some of the other broad research plans in the Arctic, and how we're sort of striving for similar objectives. I've just listed 3 here that I think you all are probably familiar with. And underneath each one are some of the main goals of those documents, and underlined in bold are some of the keywords, research, identifying impacts, forecasting, especially for decision making into the future. Those are very similar to the goals of changing Arctic ecosystems. So we're sort of in keeping with these broad documents as well. And the three main goals of changing Arctic ecosystems are first is to just really quantify the response of wildlife and their habitats to the rapid change that we're witnessing in the Arctic, and understand the mechanisms of both change and response. And then provide that information as both forecasting and mapping products to assist our Department of Interior and other partners for the trust responsibilities that they have for different wildlife species, but other partners in terms of interest that they have in how the Arctic is changing. And then really what we're trying to do is involve partners so that we can use the science that we're doing to inform their current and future decisions that need to be made. So as we develop different research plans within CAE, we are working with our Department of Interior partners to understand what kind of information they're going to need into the future, and then drafting our research around that to try to get those answers to them as well. But at the same time, we're also, a group of knowledgeable biologists here that understand the different questions that need to be addressed from things that we're observing, and that's Jerry's going to talk about some of those things that we're seeing and developing projects around. So just a quick tour of some of the things we've provided thus far and things that we've observed along the lines of the objectives that I mentioned. So in terms of wildlife response, a couple examples are some genomics works that we've done on polar bears, particularly those bears that have been observed with hair loss or alopecia, is in the photograph at the top. That was in 2012. So this was a genomics perspective that allowed us to look at tens of thousands of genes to understand stress and immune response for bears that were both having hair loss and those that were not having hair loss. And I won't go into the details, but basically it's a new method that we could use for health surveillance into the future, not just for polar bears, but potentially other species. Jerry Hupp's going to talk about snow geese and the differences in arrival dates of snow geese versus black brant and white-fronted goose on the Arctic coast, and some of the changes that could potentially bring in terms of population, distribution, and abundance as the Arctic seasons grow longer. We've also done a lot of work on black brant on the Arctic coastal plain, and not just in terms of population change, but some of the actual mechanisms that we think are driving those increases in population. And this is a panel from that bioscience paper that shows a model of how we think the coastal tundra is being inundated by saltwater as a result of sea ice decline, how there's subsidence of coastal permafrost, inundation of new sediments, and then growth of new tundra that the geese really like to forage on. And so we think that's driving a shift in distribution of molting black brant on the North Slope, and also increasing numbers of those birds. We've also provided a lot of information about changes in hydrological patterns on the Arctic coastal plain, and how those are of relevance for the yellow-billed loon, which was petitioned for listing on the ESA, and Fish and Wildlife Service made a decision about that in 2014 not to list. So we provided a lot of research to help Fish and Wildlife Service make that decision. We also have been doing a lot of work on demography of Pacific walrus based on all kinds of different data. So that was a paper that recently came out to understand sort of long-term trends in demography of Pacific walrus here in Alaska. In terms of providing forecasting and mapping products, Dave Gustine provided some information about potential future flammability of winter habitat for caribou right along the Alaska-Yukon border, and that was published in 2014. There was a Bayesian network model that was produced and recently updated by Todd Atwood et al. For polar bear projections into the future using that same Bayesian network model that I showed earlier that was done for Pacific walrus. These are the results out of the one for polar bear. And then Courtney Amundsen here in our office is currently working with Fish and Wildlife Service and their 25-year-plus aerial survey data from the North Slope to understand how trends of geese on the Arctic coastal plain and other birds are changing. And so this is just a map. The red in the North Slope area shows where the trend is for an increase in those numbers of greater white-fronted geese. And she's developing these maps for every species that Fish and Wildlife counts during that survey, so we can understand where the trends are taking place and in which habitats. As far as decisions inform, that third objective, we are providing a lot of information right now to Fish and Wildlife Service. Next year, they have to make a decision about whether or not to list Pacific walrus as a threatened or endangered species. So there's not a lot of field work taking place on walrus this year. It's a lot of publication and information getting to Fish and Wildlife Service for their decision making. And then there's been a lot of efforts on polar bears. You all probably know to inform the recovery team about sort of future work into that in the next couple of years. And as mentioned, we provide a lot of information to the yellow-bellied loon ESA decision. We've also provided a lot of information about these shifting black brant distributions, as I mentioned, and Fish and Wildlife Service has actually changed the way they do their surveys up on the North Slope to include these new areas where black brant are moving to as a result of sort of increased forage opportunities as a result of coastal change. So Fish and Wildlife Service is now doing those surveys in those box areas where in the past it was just in the Stipple, Peshawpuck Lake area. And then Jerry's going to talk about a lot of the decisions we're helping to inform in terms of increasing snow geese. There's been no new decisions made, but we're definitely providing this information to the North Slope Borough, Wildlife Management Department, and to the Pacific Flyway Council, just so they understand some of the changes that are taking place in terms of so that's it for my presentation. There's a lot more information on our website. If you just type in Changing Arctic Ecosystems, you'll find it there. And I'll turn it over to Jerry, and I guess we could take questions at the end.
Okay. Thanks, John. All right. Hi, everybody. Please speak up if you can't hear me for any reason. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about our work on changing Arctic goose populations on the North Slope. 20 years ago, Dave Ankney published this paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management, in which he noticed that a number of Arctic goose populations were increasing exponentially, a phenomena he attributed to adaptation of birds to agricultural habitats on wintering and migration areas. And this removed constraints that natural wetland habitats had previously placed on overwinter survival and physiological condition, allowed the birds to return north in better condition, and resulted in higher productivity. Concurrent with that was warming in the Arctic that resulted in fewer years of nesting failures due to late snowmelt. And in particular, the increase of the mid-continent lesser snow goose population has been fairly phenomenal. This population increased from fewer than 1 million birds to somewhat approaching 3 million within a span of about 30 years, this based on winter surveys. Shortly after Ankney published that paper, the Arctic Goose Joint Venture published this paper that looked at the effects of increasing goose populations and snow geese in particular on Arctic habitats. And they noticed the particular impact that increased snow goose populations were having in the Hudson Bay region, where because snow geese, because of their tendency to feed on underground parts of plants, had stripped the organic layer from coastal wetlands and exposed ancient marine sediments that were highly saline and were not very conducive to plant growth. And they had altered habitat on a scale that can be detected from satellite imagery, literally hundreds of square kilometers of coastal wetlands in the Hudson Bay region that have been changed. And as part of this report, the conclusion was that habitats could be permanently altered, and a management recommendation to reduce the white goose population to about 50% of its current numbers. Shortly thereafter, management agencies implemented so-called white goose conservation seasons to reduce snow goose and Ross's goose populations. They allowed some unprecedented changes in management, harvest management, that resulted in increase in harvest of geese on winter and migration areas. Fast forward to 2012, and this report, again from the Arctic Goose Joint Venture, that looked at whether these changes in harvest management had affected snow goose populations, and the upshot was not really. There were two interesting findings from this paper. One is that the snow goose populations were actually much larger than anybody really previously knew. Instead of perhaps 3 million birds in the mid-continent population, based on banding analysis, there were probably more on the order of 12 to 15 million. And despite harvests that had been substantially increased, the rate of increase in the population, though diminished, was continuing to climb, and adult survival over much of the population had not been affected. So despite the change in harvest, the population continues to increase to this day. And another interesting finding from that report is that they predicted further growth of the population, especially in the central and western Arctic. So what about snow geese on the Arctic coastal plain of Alaska during this period? Well, first off, snow geese in Alaska are part of the western Arctic population. It's managed separately from the mid-continent population, and it's quite a bit smaller relatively. It's about 1 million birds in the fall, most of which come from Banks Island. About 90% of the population nest in a colony on Banks Island, and that colony has been increasing substantially in recent years, and now about 500,000 breeding birds. In Alaska, for most of the latter half of the 20th century, snow geese really only nested in one area, at Howe Island in the Prudhoe Bay region, a small colony of only about 300 or 400 birds. But snow geese were at one time common on the North Slope. In the 19th century, they were common, especially near Barrow, but they were apparently extirpated by reindeer herders over much of their range, leaving just that remnant population on Howe Island. Now, current populations are increasing for all goose species in northern Alaska. This is modeled estimates from Fish and Wildlife Service aerial surveys. These are based on a report by Bob Stinn, in which he looked at 27 years of aerial survey data and estimated rates of increase. This is the lambda value that you see on the screen for each of the four populations, four species of geese that nest in northern Alaska. White-fronted geese are the most abundant. They're increasing, probably not quite at this rate. More recent analysis suggests it's a little bit lower, but increasing at 12 to 16% a year. The other four species of geese are not as abundant, but they too are increasing. And in particular, note the rate of increase for snow geese. Here I'm showing the rate of increase for breeding birds. Bob also estimated rate of increase for total population. This includes birds that are coming to the area simply to molt their primary feathers. And Bob concluded that if the observed rate of growth continues, the population will double about every 3 years. So right now we've got about 40,000 snow geese on the North Slope, and that population may be doubling about every 3 years. There's also data from Alaska Biological Research in which they've been monitoring a colony, the largest colony on the North Slope on the Ikpikpuk Delta. And these are their counts of nesting females fit to an exponential increase, showing that the rate of increase is about 29% a year, and that their colony is doubling again about every 3 years. So a very rapid rate of increase for snow geese on the North Slope. And if these rates of increase are projected into the future, you know, in the order of a decade or so, we could have close to 1 million geese on the North Slope, combined snow geese and white-fronted geese. Obviously, there's no guarantee that these rates of increase will continue at this level, but the question is, can we expect further increases of geese on the North Slope, and especially snow geese? And that's mostly what I talk about today. Well, one of the answers to that is how much of an increase might we expect from immigration from these other increasing populations in North America. We have a hyperabundant mid-continent population and a very large colony on Banks Island. And we're particularly interested on whether reproductive age females dispersing from those areas are coming to Alaska. And in fact, these are females that are abandoning their natal areas, the areas where they were hatched and reared, and moving to new habitats. And is Alaska one of those habitats? Well, one way we can look at this is using data from ABR in the North Slope Borough at the Ikpikpak colony and asking whether this rate of increase is possible without immigration. And the way we can do that is using a simple matrix model of population increase in which we grow the number of nesting females in the population simply based on reproductive success and survival. And in this case, the North Slope Borough and ABR have been monitoring this colony so closely that we actually have fairly good estimates for these parameters. And when we apply them in a matrix model, this is the observed rate of increase, this is the projected rate of increase, this is the model growth of the population without immigration. And in the absence of immigration, the population in the colony grows at about 14% a year, which is still a pretty substantial increase, but it's only about half of what's actually been observed. So I think we conclude that, yeah, immigration is likely contributing to the increase of Alaskan snow geese. And this has a couple of implications. One is that there is a recent estimate that about 10% of adult females annually disperse from at least one of the existing main colonies in the central Canadian Arctic. If we apply that same rate to other colonies, then there are probably hundreds of thousands of female geese, snow geese, that are dispersing from natal areas in the mid-continent population. Where they're going is not clear, but Alaska may be receiving some of those birds. Continued increases in these other populations will likely result in continued immigration to Alaska. But even without immigration, the population would still likely increase thanks to local production. And what I want to talk a little bit about now are reproductive strategies of geese on the Arctic coastal plain. This is based on work we've been doing on the Colville River Delta. And as a quick aside, we anticipate that our study site on the Colville Delta will be something of a long-term field study location, and we're totally open to collaboration with other folks in field work at this site. So if there's any interest in trying to match work with ours, please get a hold of John or me. We have 3 species of geese that nest on the Colville Delta: black brant, snow geese, and white-fronted geese. Brant and snow geese are colonial nesters. White fronts are more dispersed nesters. And to look at reproductive strategies, we first have to know a little bit about migration and the relationship to reproductive success, because birds are investing substantial energetic and nutrient expenditures to migration, and then shortly after they arrive, egg production, and then shortly after that, sitting on the eggs for about 24 days until they hatch. And during that time, feeding very little. They lose about 30% of their body mass during this period. In terms of where the birds get nutrients for eggs, they have 2 choices: basically food on the nesting area, or body reserves of fat and protein that they build during migration. And that probably depends, the source of that probably depends a little bit on their arrival chronology. Birds that arrive early have more time to feed. They can ingest more local foods, deposit those nutrients in eggs, and then save their body reserves, their reserves of fat and protein, for incubation to fuel the time that they sit on the eggs for that 24-day period. And that means they have to get off the nest less to feed so they can better protect the eggs. Conversely, a bird that arrives late on the nesting area has less time to feed, it's more time constrained, and it probably has to invest more body reserves to begin egg production quickly. And that reduces the amount of reserves it can carry into incubation and requires that it gets off the nest more frequently to feed and exposing the eggs to potential predators during that time. And we've looked at this with snow geese and brant using geolocators. These are light-sensing devices that we attach to the leg of the birds. They're quite small. They detect ambient light, and from that we can calculate sunrise, sunset times, which in turn tell us where the bird is approximately. So we can look at the winter and spring migration distributions based on recovery of these geolocators. But also, because they give us a light indicator, we can look at times when the geolocator was shaded. And these are both nighttime periods during the course of the year. And you can see that in the spring, when the bird arrives in the Arctic, it goes into 24-hour daylight. So we get a nice chronological assessment of arrival date in the Arctic from these things. And then, when they start to incubate, we get this very obvious band of darkness when the bird is setting on the eggs. But then during these periods, there are incubation breaks where the bird gets off the nest to feed. And so we can look at the interval between arrival and incubation to get a measure of the pre-nesting interval, how long the bird is able to get Arctic foods before starting to nest. And we can also look at how much time it's spending away from the nest during incubation. And what we see for snow geese versus brant is that snow geese are arriving in the Arctic earlier, have about a week longer pre-nesting interval than brant. And that may give them more time to get those local foods. White-fronted geese, also based on just arrival observations on the nesting area, arrive quite early. They also have about a 3-week period between their arrival in the Arctic and the onset of incubation. So based on that, what are we seeing in terms of source nutrients for eggs? We did some stable isotope analysis looking at where birds were getting nutrients for egg production. And pretty much as we predicted, snow geese and white fronts that have this long pre-laying interval in 2011 invested more local foods in the eggs than did brant, which have a short pre-laying period. Brant are putting more of their body reserves into eggs. However, in 2012, snow geese, even though they arrived early, encountered a very cold period during their egg development and had to resort more to body reserves during that period. White fronts and brant kept on their strategies that they had used the previous year. They nested a little later. They missed that cold period. And then in 2013, it was a little bit colder than 2011. Both brant and white fronts were, again, using a little bit more reserves. But brant across all years kind of stick to the same strategy regardless of conditions. So what this tells us is that snow geese are pretty flexible. If conditions are good, they can get local foods and then put those into eggs and retain the reserves for incubation. If conditions are cold, they're going to be putting more of their body reserves into eggs. But either way, they're able to produce the eggs. They're able to successfully raise a clutch of eggs. And one thing we think this implies is that Arctic warming may favor these so-called income breeders, the birds that are getting foods on the nesting area, because a warming Arctic makes foods available earlier. And if the birds can arrive in time to take advantage of that earlier food availability, they can invest more of those local nutrients in eggs and save their reserves for incubation. And it looks like, in the case of geese, they are, in fact, advancing their arrival dates. This is some data published by David Ward in our office. David looked at a long-term arrival chronology of water birds on the Colville Delta based on observations of Jim Helmrichs, who homesteaded up there with his family back in the 1950s. And here, the vertical bars are confidence intervals surrounding the rate of increase in arrival dates across years for a variety of water birds. The dashed horizontal line across the middle is the rate of advancement in breakup date for the Kaparic River. So this provides a metric for advancing phenology. Birds whose confidence intervals intercept that line are generally keeping pace with changing Arctic phenology. Those who fall below it are not doing quite as well. And we see that geese, here snow geese and white-fronted geese, are doing quite nicely in keeping pace with changing Arctic phenology. They've advanced their arrival dates over the years on the Colville. Brant have also, but not quite as quickly as snow geese and brant. So we've got two species, a large-bodied snow goose that has a larger pre-laying interval and in most years invests more local nutrients in eggs. Brant, which are small-bodied, have a shorter pre-laying interval and invest more body reserves in eggs. And what we see is that, as we kind of predicted, brant have lower incubation constancy than snow geese. They're getting off the nest more often to feed, and that exposes the eggs to higher predation rates. And in fact, what we're also seeing is that snow geese have higher reproductive success. They, in most years, have hatched about 25% more young than brant. So there seem to be some life history consequences of reproductive strategies here, where the source of nutrients that the birds are getting for eggs may affect their overall reproductive success. The exception of this is when bears show up on the nesting colonies, like they did in 2013 and 2014. In that case, it doesn't really matter what you do, whether you stay on the nest or not. You know, bears are going to have a major effect on reproductive success. But in other years, avian predators are the more common predator, and brant are more susceptible to those. So immigration is contributing to the rate of increase for snow geese on the North Slope. High reproductive success is also contributing. Adult survival is also high based on our band recovery data. Barring changes elsewhere, we expect the snow goose population is going to continue to grow in northern Alaska. And the question is, will the habitat support an increase? So the last little bit I want to talk about here is some work we've been doing on gosling growth. Gosling growth is a sensitive indicator of habitat quality for goose populations. And as goose populations increase and remove forage from brooding habitats, gosling growth rates can decline. And as body size of juveniles declines, juvenile survival also declines. So there's this density-dependent feedback in habitat quality that can have demographic consequences. Our question is gosling growth rate changed with the increase in goose populations on the North Slope? The way we do this is we mark a sample of goslings at hatch while they're still in the egg. We put a small tag through webbing on their foot. We recapture the birds about 30 days later during large-scale brood drives, and we look for these marked juveniles, and then we measure their body mass and body size. These are the data for juvenile snow geese on the Colville. By themselves, they don't mean much, but if we compare them to goslings in the Hudson Bay area where populations are quite high, we see that on average, snow geese on the Colville Delta are about 200 grams heavier than similar-aged snow geese in Hudson Bay. And we also have evidence of high first-year survival for juvenile snow geese on the Colville. Has the increase in snow geese and white-fronted geese adversely affected gosling growth for brant? Jim Settinger measured growth rates for brant on the Colville Delta back in the mid-1990s and derived this estimate for the relationship between age and body mass. We've replicated Jim's study in recent years, and in looking at our estimates for growth rates of brant, find that across the ages where we've sampled same-age birds, our estimates are identical to Jim's. So across 20 years, despite an approximately 5-fold increase in goose populations on the Arctic coastal plain, we're not yet seeing any adverse effects of the increase in goose populations on growth rates of black brant. And brant on the Arctic coastal plain are heavier than Yukon Delta goslings, where most of the Pacific brant population nests, and Arctic coastal plain brant have higher first-year survival. We also see that the standing crop of forage biomass is relatively little affected by grazing on the North Slope, and that the grazed biomass in the Colville Delta is about 2 to 4 times higher than on the Yukon Delta, where there are higher goose densities. We have very substantial grazing lawns. These are areas where geese crop the Carex subspathicea quite short, but they also fertilize it with feces, and this maintains a highly productive environment with a high-quality forage that's very much favored during brood rearing. So there's currently no evidence the brood habitat on the Coldwell Delta will become limiting in the near future. There's also little evidence of adverse grazing impacts on the Atchiput Delta based on work by the North Slope Borough. And grazing lawns may be increasing in extent. And this is something that John referenced in his presentation. Permafrost deterioration may be allowing subsidence of freshwater coastal areas, allowing more marine inundation and converting those into halophytic sedges, such as Carex subspathicea, that provide a highly nutritional forage for geese. So the habitat availability may be improving on the North Slope for geese. So again, coming back to this, these are our projected increases if the rates of increase continue. You know, we don't know that those rates are going to be held, but I think we can conclude that barring changes to demographic processes elsewhere, we will predict that snow geese are going to continue to increase on the Arctic coastal plain. And is this what we're going to see? Or are we going to see an effect comparable to the Hudson Bay area? Probably not. It's a very different system. We don't anticipate that even if there's a substantial population increase that we'll see this level of habitat alteration. But I think we do want to start thinking more about the top-down effects of geese on the environment. You know, to date, as John mentioned, most of our CAE work has been the bottom-up drivers of wildlife abundance. And I think we're kind of looking now at moving into a phase of top-down. How are geese affecting their environment and affecting other species in their presence? And I think what we want to do is continue some of the things we've been doing with population monitoring, but start doing more studies looking at effects of snow geese and other goose species on nutrient cycling, look at interspecific competition, especially between snow geese and brant. Brant populations are more of a concern. They've been closer to management objectives and at times below their management objectives over time. And we want to understand whether the increase in snow geese may be adversely affecting black brant and how the overall increase of all goose populations is affecting community productivity in coastal areas. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to advise management agencies in terms of population objectives for snow geese and other species, how to achieve those objectives, what the implications of these increases are for things like subsistence and resource development on the North Slope, and also what the increase in snow geese from Alaska may mean for impacts to non-breeding areas. So I think with that, I'll close, and I think John and I are available to take any questions if anybody has any.
Are there any questions for either of the speakers? All right.